Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
Our conversation this time round is called the Titanic Clash. And this does, I think, sort of follow on from our previous conversation called the Impossible Promises, because it features Elijah again and Ahab, so King Ahab and the prophet Elijah. What's the background, though, for anybody who hasn't heard our previous conversation?
Yeah, very much so. So we did say in that previous episode that after the death of King Solomon, the nation of Israel split into two. 10 tribes in the north became known as Israel from that point on. 2 in the south become known as Judah. And the kings of the north become increasingly godless, wanting to mix the worship of Yahweh, Israel's God, the living God, with the worship of Baal, a fertility god of that time, and the worship of Baal becoming more and more dominant and more attractive. And one of the seasons in which Baal worship is heavily promoted and the worship of Yahweh, the living God, almost obliterated, is during the reign of that king that you just mentioned, King Ahab. And perhaps we can do no better than actually read the introduction to his reign that tells us a little bit about that, which is in 1 Kings 16 from verse 29, where we read that in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, that's 874 BC, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, the north. And he reigned in Samaria, his capital, over Israel for 22 years. Now, here's the juicy bit. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sons of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who'd been the first king of the north, who'd rebelled from the south, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria, and Ahab also made an Asherah pole. Asherah was the female counterpart to Baal, and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. Wow. So this is pretty heavy duty here, isn't it? And most of it stimulated by this woman he marries, Queen Jezebel, whose father was the king of Sidon. And we know that the Baal worship in Sidon at this time was particularly virulent, particularly strong. And she brings that strong worship of Baal to Israel with her as she comes. And she clearly was a powerful woman, these chapters reveal to us. And she really does dominate King Ahab and manages to impose on him pretty much all of her wishes. We see King Ahab coming out pretty weak, really, in some of these chapters. So by this point in the history of Israel, the northern kingdom, Yahweh worship is almost on the point of being snuffed out, which is why God has raised up Elijah to contend on his behalf. Elijah, the prophet whom we looked at previously, who was a fiery character, frankly, a bit sullen and a bit of a loner as well, but a real warrior on behalf of the true living God against Ahab and Jezebel and this religion that they promoted, sponsored, of worship of Baal, Baal the fertility god, who controlled the weather and who controlled the growing of the crops. And there'd been a great clash because, as we saw in our previous episode, Elijah has prophesied to the king that as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next 3 years except by my word. So there's been a drought for 3 years. Hey, where's Baal? He's supposed to be the God in charge of the weather and the crop growing, isn't he? And he doesn't seem to be doing anything. Why? Because Yahweh, the living God, is on the throne. But King Ahab and his wife Jezebel just won't bow to that truth.
And I just want to dwell just for a second or two more on that relationship between King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. That was a particular marriage where King Ahab had sort of married out of his own faith, if you like. She brought in her pagan beliefs in a significant way by the sound of it. And I'm just sort of conscious of how even today in marriages where people aren't aligned spiritually, that can be such a challenging position.
Which is why actually both Old Testament and New Testament tell God's people that they shouldn't marry outside of the family of faith. Now, that might sound a bit stark, but there are enough examples in the Bible, like this example, where the unbelieving partner drags the other one down. And I, as a pastor, over many, many decades now, have seen this happen again and again, where someone has ended up marrying a non-Christian because they felt there were no Christians around or whatever. And good though the person might be, they always end up drawing that person away. It's very, very rare for the other way to happen and them to draw them into faith. Now, I do want to say quickly, if any of our listeners are married to someone who is not a Christian, that's definitely not a reason there for divorcing them. Actually, Paul deals with that issue in 1 Corinthians, and he says there, well, look, if you are married to a non-Christian, just stay with them, live a godly life, pray for them. Who knows what God may do? But the Bible is very clear. If you want to walk in God's way and have God's blessing, then don't marry someone who's an unbeliever. Don't marry someone who doesn't share your faith. Why? Because faith's not a tack-on. It's not an optional extra. It's not, and on Sundays I go to church at 11 o'clock or whatever time it might be. This is a whole way of living. And how can you do a whole way of living in which you are saying, God is number one in my life. God determines what I do, where I go, how I spend my money, with a partner for whom that is not the priority? It simply doesn't work.
And it sounds like for Ahab, it had become a take it or leave it faith.
Yes. And, Jezebel had been incredibly powerful. We actually get a glimpse a little bit later on in 1 Kings 21, where the king wants to buy up the land next to his palace of a guy called Naboth, who's got a vineyard there, and he refuses to sell it. And the king goes home and sulks to his wife that this guy said no, and his wife says, leave it to me, and arranges for the guy to be murdered, and then says, now go and take over his field, it won't cost you anything. So this is the sort of woman that she was, and she certainly doesn't want him to take anything from the worship of Yahweh. She is trying to obliterate it completely, and, it's almost at that point. And even now, after 3 years of drought, she has no intention of giving in, as the chapter that we're going to look at today will show us.
So I should imagine she's no big fan of Elijah, a prophet of God, or any of other God's prophets.
Oh, absolutely not. She is out and out to get rid of this guy. And as we look at 1 Kings 18, we discover some sort of backstory there that she'd actually been responsible for, I'll read the words, for killing off the Lord's prophets. And some of the other prophets had to take some of them and hide them in caves to protect them. So she is virulent, ruthless in her opposition to the living God and to his prophets. So this is a scary scene. So when we get the first surprise in our story in 1 Kings 18, in this Titanic clash that's coming, chapter 18 opens with the words, after a long time in the 3rd year. Okay, so we're at the end of the 3 years now that Elijah prophesied there would be a drought. The word of the Lord came to Elijah saying, go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land.
Married to the very woman that's trying to kill all these people.
Yes, so I don't know about you, but I probably feel I'd want a bit of negotiation with God on that one. Could I not send an email or whatever it was they had in those days? But it wouldn't be my first choice. And it is a measure of the man Elijah, of his strength of faith and his sheer dogged determination, that he does exactly what God tells him to do and sets off on his way to go and speak to the king, and this time to bring the word, not that there will be drought for 3 years, but God's now going to speak and there will be rain on the land, so you can see who is really in control of the weather.
I'm just trying to imagine the scene. So this is Elijah knocking on the king's front door, asking for a meeting.
Yes, it's pretty crazy, isn't it, from our point of view? It really does seem incredible, but he does it. And the story ends up being completely full of surprises. I mean, the king's, not very happy to see him, really. As we read in verse 16, Obadiah the prophet, whom he'd met on his way back there and who goes back with a message, went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. So they meet up somewhere, perhaps it's in the palace, perhaps it's in the courtyard, perhaps it's halfway. And when he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" Why does he say that? Well, because this is the man who is responsible for drought on the land for 3 years. If only you'd stopped to think about that. Elijah was not the man responsible for drought on the land. He himself, Ahab, was responsible for the drought on the land by rejecting the living God. And yet he wants to push the blame onto someone else. Isn't it funny? We can still do that today. And everyone can see whose fault it is, but we want to constantly blame other people and see them as the source of the trouble that came our way. And so Elijah responds, he says, "I've not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You've abandoned the Lord's command and followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So here clearly are the key prophets being called together, the ones who oppose him. He's saying, let's have a fight, gather them all, let's settle this once and for all, and gives this incredible challenge as the people gather. We read that Ahab sent word throughout Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. It's this huge mountain that overlooks the plain of Jezreel before it. And Elijah went before the people and says, wow, how long will you waver between two opinions? How long will you limp between two opinions? Some of the older versions have, if the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. Still a challenge, I think, there to us today, isn't there, David, with that word? How long will you limp between two opinions? You can't half serve God and half serve something else in life. All you'll end up doing is limping between the two and not enjoying either. So he is calling the people to decision time. And how will he call them to do that? Through the Titanic Clash that we're looking at today.
I'm just trying to picture the scene again. This is this amazing face-to-face meeting between Ahab and Elijah, and Ahab's wife, Jezebel, is after Elijah's head, in a sense.
Yeah.
So the situation that Elijah's going into, but he's dare I say, he's making it even worse. He's actually challenging the king to this clash on the mountaintop.
Incredible, isn't it? I mean, again, I think this reveals something of the guy. God always picks the right people for these works, and Elijah was a
straight talking,
straight talking, cuss it sort of guy. Really, even when God gives him a young prophet to train up and be his successor in Elisha, and Elisha responds to God and goes after him. Elijah's only response is when he says, I just need to go and say goodbye to my family first. And he says, what's that to me? Shrugs his shoulders, doesn't care. He's quite happy to work on his own. He's a loner. He's got his own way of doing things. So I don't imagine he would be the easiest of characters to get along with or have in your home group. And yet he was the man for the moment. It needed this sort of fiery, straight-talking guy who was not going to be cowed by those who claimed to have power but had none, really.
So the challenge is laid before everybody, and how does it all pan out?
Well, he challenges them to a contest. And he says to the prophets who've been gathered on Mount Carmel, go and get 2 bulls for us, then let the prophets of Baal and Asherah choose one of them, cut it into pieces, ready for a sacrifice, and then lay it on the wood, ready to offer a burnt offering to their God. But don't set fire to it yet. And then I'll do the same. But what I want you to do is, you call on the name of your God. You call on the name of Baal. You call on the name of Asherah. And I'll call on the name of the Lord, Yahweh. And he says this, the God who answers by fire, he is God. In other words, we've got 2 sacrifices ready. Let's call on our gods to send fire from heaven to ignite these sacrifices, and we'll see who's God. We'll see who's in control of the elements, whether it is Baal or Yahweh.
This wasn't just an empty taunt.
No, it wasn't, because he's going to see it through. He's absolutely determined to see it through. And actually, this chapter is one of my favourite in the whole of the Bible, because as well as the drama that is involved, there's even bits of humour interspersed with it as well. So if I just read the next bit that happens as they do this, it says that they, the prophets of Baal, called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. So they're really going at it. Remember, there's 400 of each kind of prophet here. So 800 of them really going for this, shouting, praying, chanting, whatever it was they were doing. Oh, Baal, answer us, they shouted. But I love this bit. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar that they'd made. And at noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he says. Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Interesting, that expression in Hebrew, he's busy, could well mean that he's gone to the bathroom. He's busy with a particular function, which brings out the human even more. So here he is saying, come on, you're perhaps just not shouting loud enough. Perhaps your God's, just deep in thought and he's lost his concentration. He might be busy. He might have gone to the bathroom. Goes on to say, perhaps he's sleeping and you've got to wake him up. Hear the taunts. I mean, this is bold stuff in the presence of Ahab and Jezebel and these 800 prophets. So they just get stirred up even more. We read that they shouted louder. They slashed themselves with swords and spears because it was believed the letting of blood would somehow stimulate the gods. But midday passed and they continued their frantic prophesying, it says, until the time came for the evening sacrifice. And these lovely words, but there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. I imagine at this point, the prophets of Baal and Asherah must have been utterly exhausted. They've now had several hours of frantic crying out, praying, dancing, slashing themselves. It is indeed an incredible scenario that we are seeing here.
Either Elijah's got a sense of humour, or he's so incredulous as to their lack of understanding about his God.
Yeah, I wonder which it is. It's probably a mixture of both, because there is humour there. Some of this is really funny. Perhaps your gods have gone to the bathroom. Maybe he's gone on a journey, or perhaps he's nodded off. So there is humour here, but there's also provocation. This is a man who is convinced he knows his God and is convinced there is no power in their gods for all that they are saying. So, but incredible in the context of the opposition and threat that there was to him.
So what happened next?
What happened next is the good bit. The Titanic Clash comes to a head. So I'm glad you asked me that bit, David. The first thing he does is he rebuilt the altar of the Lord. You see, worship of the Lord, worship of Yahweh got so neglected that his altars had got broken down and discarded, maybe the stones that made them used for other things. So the first thing he does is he rebuilds the altar of the Lord. It's like he's setting the Lord right back at the center of everything. And then, having built that altar, he tells them to dig a trench around it, to ditch all around it. And then he puts the wood on top of the altar and the bull pieces that have been put there and puts them on top of the altar, and then says this crazy thing: fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and the wood. So soak the wood and the offering with water. So they do it. And then he says, do it again. And they do it again. And then he says, do it a 3rd time. So 3 times he's done this. So the water runs down. It's now filling the trench. It's completely sodden.
There's no doubt that an accidental spark couldn't set this up.
Absolutely nothing is going to accidentally set this off. And clearly that's what he's wanting to show. He doesn't want anyone to say, oh, well, you just caught a spark from that altar over there, didn't it? Or that torch that person was carrying. So 12 jars of water of now, large jars. We don't just think little jars. It would have been those huge storage jars that they use. What does he do next? He waits for the time of sacrifice. It's the time of the evening sacrifice. Again, he's doing everything according to the book, a rebuilt Yahweh altar made of uncut stones as the law required. He's now waiting for the time of the evening sacrifice. And at that point, he prays. He says this: O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And here's the wow moment. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and it licked up the water in the trench. We've seen, haven't we, in previous episodes, how fire often symbolized the presence of God. We've seen it in the Exodus as a pillar of fire led the people. On the day of Pentecost, tongues of fire come on the heads of the followers of Jesus. Fire represents God in all his holiness and power. And they had called for fire and couldn't do it. Now he calls to the Lord for fire from heaven, and fire comes down out of heaven and consumes all of this. And when the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Here's an interesting thing. Elijah's name means the Lord, he is God. They're calling out, Eliyah, Eliyah, Yahweh is indeed the Lord. At last, they have seen it. The Titanic Clash has proved that God, the living God, and God alone is God over all things, and that Baal is completely without power.
So a complete contrast between all the shouting and screaming of the hundreds of prophets and just the one single prayer from Elijah.
Very good thought, David. Yeah, you see, it's not for how much shouting that we heard, but for sincerity of heart. And here is a man with a sincere heart who has heard God, who is obeying God, who's standing on God's promise, who's trusting what God said, who's now very simply calling upon him, Lord, send your fire. And down it comes. What a contrast. And what an impact that must have made. Remember, hours and hours, those prophets of Baal were busy doing their stuff and nothing but one prayer from the mouth of the man of God. And the people are overawed and end up saying, the Lord is God. The Lord is God. It's not Baal after all, is it? Wow. What a moment that must have been.
What were the consequences of all of this? The consequences, for example, for the prophets of Baal?
Well, it doesn't end well for them, one has to say, because Elijah then says, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away. And they seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. So these people who were responsible for misleading thousands upon thousands of God's people are put to death. So for them, it doesn't end well. I love the bit that then follows, because Elijah then turns to King Ahab, who of course has been standing on the side watching all this happen. What was going on in his face? I would love to have had a shot of that. But he turns to Ahab and now says a wonderful prophetic declaration as well. Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. Remember, it's been a drought for 3 years. Actually, at that moment he said it, there was nothing. But prophetically, he heard it and declared it. So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed up to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground and put his face between his knees, and he starts to pray, and he prays into being what God has given him. Isn't that interesting? God's given him the prophetic word, but he now prays it into being. He doesn't just say, oh, well, God's spoken, so that's it. He prays, and as he prays, he tells his servant to go and look out towards the sea. Why towards the sea? Because that's where the rains come from in Israel. And he says, can you see anything? And the servant says, no, can't see anything. 7 times he sends him back to go and look if he sees anything. And it's only on the 7th time. Remember, we've seen 7, God's number, the perfect number, the number that symbolizes, hey, God is at work. And on the 7th time, the servant says, I can see a cloud as small as a man's hand rising from the sea. And at that point, Elijah says, then go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds. The wind rose. A heavy rain came on, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. And the power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Wow, just imagine the excitement of that happening as this guy prophesies rain, sees nothing, prays it into being, and there it comes, and he tells King Ahab, you better get going quick, boy, because if not, you're going to get caught in this thunderstorm that's coming.
We've all experienced that on the edge of a storm, and we think we're ahead of it, and it catches up with us. But yeah, so there's a scene with Elijah running ahead of the king, who's presumably going by chariot.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? I think something of the Holy Spirit just caught him up there, and I think there's something supernatural going on. This is one of those moments in the Old Testament where, because the worship of the Lord is almost extinguished, we see demonstrations of power like we've not seen before for a long time. And it certainly must have been mind-blowing. I think this Titanic Clash would have stuck in their minds for many, many years to come.
Now, I can only imagine that Jezebel is not going to be very happy, but presumably Elijah is on a high.
He is, and both of those things that you said are absolutely true, David. Jezebel is not happy at all. As chapter 19 opens and Ahab goes back to Jezebel and gives her an account of everything that happens, Jezebel then sends a message to Elijah. And the message is this: may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them, the prophets he's killed. Here is a clear threat from Jezebel that she intends to take his life by this time tomorrow. She is livid that not only her prophets have been killed, but that she personally has been humiliated. These are prophets that she has brought from Sidon with her. And I suppose, yeah, Elijah was on a high, but this was a pretty fearsome woman as well. And we read that Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Interesting, isn't it? He's just seen such incredible power from God. And yet now this woman says, I'm going to get you, boy. And he runs in fear for his life. I think probably the sheer emotional energy of the output of what he'd done just left him exhausted. And in fact, we find him running away, and God sort of catching up with him, and God in his kindness sending an angel to say, look, the first thing you need is food and sleep. By the way, very often when we're depressed, which he became at this point, some of the simplest things we need is good food and good sleep to get the chemicals back in order again in our body. But he runs, and what he needs then is an encounter with God himself. And there's that story in chapter 19 of how God comes, and he thinks he's going to see God in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but actually he encounters God in none of them. What he encounters God in is what is often translated a still small voice, or the Hebrew could be translated the sound of a gentle whisper. Sometimes it's not the noise and the razzmatazz that we need. Sometimes all we need to do is stop and be still and listen for that quiet whisper of God that says, I'm here, I'm with you, I haven't given up on you. And that's what happens here, and God recommissions him and sends him renewed and refreshed on his way again.
How important is it for us to hear that still small voice?
Yeah, absolutely vital. We live in a busy world. Actually, it's often quite hard to get a bit of peace and quiet, isn't it? Whether you're in the office or at home, if you've got kids, there's always the TV on in the background. We've got phones in our pockets that are constantly bipping and beeping and telling us there is an urgent message here. I know you are there, David Taverner. Get your phone out now and answer this. So our whole world is full of busyness and noise, isn't it? So I think, we need those times when we can just get away, to be still, to be quiet. Yes, we can pray to God anywhere, in the car, on the bus, on the train, wherever we're going, walking, working, whatever. But all of us need those times when we can just be quiet to listen for that little voice, that little nudge, that little reassurance, that guidance that God wants to bring to us.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.